In all fairness, we must point out that many of the subjects which we wish to discuss this evening still remain among the great unsolved mysteries of life. This should not too greatly perturb us, however, for the simplest elements of living that we know are actually equally mysterious. We have made a great study of the origin of man merely through the mystery of human birth, and yet the processes involved in the actual development of the embryo and the forces behind the molding and shaping of the future body of a living person, these remain mysteries even now. When we come to solve these mysteries to our own satisfaction, it merely means that we attain an unbroken record of those changes and processes which are visible to us. Those parts which are invisible, those causal elements, substances and principles, still elude the intellectual quest with which man seeks to solve the riddle of himself. Therefore, when we go back into the great eras of time, to the great primordial world, we cannot go with complete certainties. Even records brought through from extrasensory perception sources are by no means in conformity. This does not necessarily indicate contradiction, for it may be that these records relate to different phases of the innumerable processes which came together to form the present state of things. In any event, however, one of our primary questions has always been, how did life get to the earth? One of the great scientific stoppers in this is the condition of the earth in its earliest stages. We assume that it was a molten mass, that it gradually crystallized into its material form as the result of innumerable ages, aeons of time, and that this gradual cooling finally brought the earth to a condition in which it could sustain the various types of flora and fauna which first appeared. The problem of how life survived this tremendous transition from a molten mass to a reasonably organized, habitable world is a mystery. But we can again bring to bear upon it certain known elements, and out of the subconscious of man, which must finally be our greater source of information, there comes again this pageantry of legend, of myth, and of story, by which it seems that we are seeking to answer, through dreams and visions, the questions that we ask. If it is true that life as we know it could not survive the terrific, incalculable combustion of the first age, then we are confronted with several questions. If life could not begin upon the earth with its own beginning, could not have come here with the fire, mist, and the vapors which ultimately united to form a planet, then it had to be communicated in some way from elsewhere, from some other state or condition, in order that the earth might be fruitful and bear the kinds and forms of life that we know. Actually, we do not know that life could not have survived the terrific incendiary state of the primordial world. But this that we do know, that life as we understand it today could not have survived, that it would have been incinerated in all its structures and forms, that it would have been incapable of reproducing itself or surviving. Therefore, we must either assume that a hypothesis about the beginning of the planet is wrong, or we must assume that our understanding of the substance and essence of life itself must be wrong, or we have some other choices. we can also consider the possibility of life coming here or reaching here from some state in which it could survive, and by circumstances and means sufficiently natural and non-miraculous to explain how this planet, or perhaps all other planets, could have in the beginning have been populated with some kind of creatures, of which man is, to our mind and thinking, the outstanding example. The Greeks help us a little in this, the Hindus also, Chinese have a few suggestions, and the Egyptians have contributed something. From their various speculations, we arrive at certain hypotheses, and these are varyingly reasonable, and their final solution depends upon a greater knowledge of the substance and function of essential life principles than we have today. Therefore, we cannot assume a bigoted attitude or feel that any reasonable or plausible answer must inevitably be correct. Today, in our thinking, we must seek for such answers as are most reasonable according to our knowledge, praying that additional knowledge may make us more reasonable and also ultimately convey to us an insight that is adequate. One possible solution to this mystery was given to us by ancient peoples who declared that the life principle itself, or the life essences, by which all things are sustained, actually is always and eternally within the power and ray of the sun. Therefore, that any field upon which the ray of the sun descends, or against which the ray of the sun is reflected, receives not only light, but a life principle locked in light. And therefore, as soon as the earth itself was able to sustain the life which the sun could bestow upon it, the sunlight itself carried the necessary life units, and therefore that life began as the result of sun, earth, and moisture. That this was apparently a spontaneous development, but that in accordance with the concept of the ancients, the light itself was the power of God, or the power of life. This life, meeting a proper element, finding in its fleshing out of things an appropriate ground into which it might penetrate, caused a certain fertilization of matter. And from these two, with moisture and the various vicissitudes of the seasons, there resulted what might have been regarded at first as a spontaneous generation. Spontaneous only because man has not yet realized that spirit, matter, and moisture constitute the three essential elements by which all life comes into manifestation. The persons and schools of thought embracing this concept did not actually believe that this life carried by the sun was merely a physical thing, nor did they believe that the form generated by this life had merely a physical existence. These forms or bodies became the instruments for the inner energies of this life. For as surely as the visible ray of the sun conveys certain germinal powers, so the sun also has locked within it the psychic life and the spiritual life of man. Thus, to these ancient thoughts, all life comes from the sun, which is the generator, the redeemer, the creator, and the renovator of all things. And wherever in the solar system the ray of the sun can strike, in that place there can be living things growing up, each according to the environment circumstances in which it finds itself. This might be termed in general the solar theory of life. A second theory, which also had considerable acceptance among the Hindu peoples in ancient times, was that the entire story of the generation of a planet is exactly the same on a macrocosmic level as the generation of man himself on a microcosmic level. The body of man created in the womb gradually unfolds its integrated structure until it can be quickened. And at that time, an abiding life enters into it totally and collectively, ensouling it, so that, as one of the ancient writers said, the earth becomes the body of a blessed God. The Emperor Julian refers to this in his hymn to the Mother of the Gods. This ensoulment of the planet by a god was held by some people to explain how life became available here. It was then no longer simply a life brought here from the outside, but a total being coming into embodiment, coming into incarnation from a previous state. And according to the ancient peoples, the earth spirit that took upon itself the body of our planet came here from a previous embodiment, and that previous embodiment was the moon. Therefore, the moon is the cast-off body of the planetary Logos, or Ishvara, the Lord of this world. If, therefore, a being comes into embodiment by the quickening process of a planet gradually unfolding its structure like an embryo until it can be embodied, thus serving as an instrument for a rational spiritual entity, then, as in the case of man, many mysteries seemingly are explained. If they are not explained, they are at least acceptable by comparison with other known things, as, for example, that in all probabilities there are as many separate living creatures within man as there are separate living creatures on the face of the earth. There are hundreds of billions of living things working together, conspiring together, laboring together in order that man may have the compound structure that he now knows. The ancients believed that in some way the lives of these things came into man with the collective consciousness of himself. Therefore, having once established his own conscious polarity, the life in man begins to unfold out of its own nature, the infinitude of parts, which are gradually to become lesser centers of life within its compound structure. This, then, is an ensoulement idea, and perhaps is one of the most interesting and dramatic of all the solutions that have been given. In taking this, we then pass through a modification, because we not only study embryology as it is now physically studied, but we have to consider it in the terms of ancient thought. If we wish, for example, to accept or to consider seriously the idea of the planet as an ensouled being, Plato's animal crawling through space, if we wish to take this attitude, then we must try to understand a little more about how the ancients understood the quickening process relating to man. They held that the human body was worked upon in two ways. First, from without, by an invisible magnetic field of the entity that was later to occupy it. This entity, enclosing a certain area, protects the embryo, molding it into the archetype of the magnetic field of the entity itself, thus moving upon it. Or as it is said in Genesis, the spirits of the Elohim moved upon the face of the deep. These spirits moving upon the face of the deep were regarded in India and other ancient nations as powers moving over the surface of an embryo world or an embryo being, molding it, modeling it, influencing, affecting it, gradually bringing it into the organization which must later sustain the incarnation of this being. When a certain degree had been reached of development, then these powers moved into embodiment, and taking up their places in the 7 sacred centers within man, began to rule from within. Then their energies and their powers and their will and their dictum ideated from the centers of man, gradually working upon the body, controlling it and directing it.